Hi, my name is Tianyu Shea. I'm a third-year medical student at the New York Institute of Technology, and you're listening to Do or Do Not. Welcome to our 6th episode. In our interviews so far, we have been talking to established physicians that range from academic deans to clinicians. This is the first episode in our resident series where we will be talking to osteopathic residents in various specialties. We hope that these interviews will provide listeners with information and insight into a physician's life at a different career point. On this fantastic episode, Dr. Storch will talk with Dr. Ryan Moncman, a fifth-year neurosurgical resident at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. They will discuss a variety of topics, from what it's like to have a neurosurgeon as a father to his best advice on how to get into the specialty. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Ryan, thank you for talking to me today.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right, Ryan. So you are a neurosurgical resident. So I was thinking maybe you just start. I think it's really cool to be a brain surgeon. Again, it's definitely much cooler than what I do. Neat stuff. Very impressive to me. So why don't you tell me about some of the surgeries or what your week's been like? Just tell me a little bit about just day to day, what kind of things you do.
Yeah. So in the Corona age, right now we're ramping back up, which is actually pretty nice. We're starting to have a more normal schedule. I did 2 emergent cases this week. One was just burr holes for a subdural hemorrhage, and another was a hemicraniectomy for intracranial hemorrhage or hemorrhage within the tissue. And then we did a couple of spinal decompressions. We did an anterior cervical decompression at a single level at C6, C7, and then we also did a posterior cervical, a C3 to T1. Yeah.
Just to translate for, maybe there's some students listening, and again, I'm a gastroenterologist. Basically, the first thing you put a hole in somebody's brain, took part of the skull off, right? And
Exactly.
then we're cutting in and fixing somebody's spinal cord.
Yeah, exactly. Burr holes we do with patient with chronic blood in their head. It comes out like motor oil, and we don't have to make a big window into the skull. You drill holes about the size of a quarter in a couple of spots, and you drain it out. And exactly the other time we would do a much larger incision and take a window of bone off. And when blood is fresh, it clots, and it's kind of like a big piece of jelly. It doesn't come out. So you have to go in and chase after it. And then, exactly. The other ones are we go in through the front part of the neck, or we go in through the back part of the neck, depending on what those cushions or discs between the bones look like.
Very cool. So tell me now, just going back, we spoke a little bit before, and I know that your dad was a neurosurgeon also. Can you tell me a little bit about what it's like growing up with a dad that's a brain surgeon?
Yeah, it's certainly very interesting. I can kind of remember my first experiences driving into the hospital with my dad when I was 5, and I would kind of walk around and do rounds with him and go to the hospital cafeteria, and you would, here and there. Back then, there weren't a lot of rules about what you could and couldn't do. So I would be listening to him, talking to patients and families and those types of things. And as I got older and kind of grew into it, I would, here and there do hospital rotations, and I was always really interested in medicine. But I didn't really get a good appreciation for what he did until probably the year before I started medical school. And then a couple years thereafter, I actually did a formal rotation with him when I was a MS2.
Was he away a lot? Did you feel like he was working a lot? You didn't get to see him that much? Or how was that?
He was at the important things, which I think is what mattered most. I don't have a single time in my life where I look back and said to myself, I never really saw my dad, or this isn't a career where I can have a family or anything like that. Those types of things that we hear from time to time, or from people outside of our specialty, will say that our life is very hectic, very busy, no family life, no relationships, those types of things. It's just about managing your expectations, managing your workload, and making sure you know when to say when. And he did a very good job with that, because I never looked back and thought to myself, he didn't really miss a sporting event. We didn't, miss vacations. We didn't do anything like that where I said, oh man, he's too busy for me.
So in the modern term, you would say your dad managed his work-life balance. It's like a key phrase, even as a neurosurgeon, and as a kid growing up, you think he did a good job.
Yeah. Even, into being an adult, whenever I would drive out to Ohio and see him, he was Q2 for the latter part of his career. And even when he was doing that, we still found time to go and play golf and go out to eat and do all those things.
That's great. Yeah. Now, your dad, you also told me, obviously, the name of the podcast is Do or Do Not. Your dad was an osteopathic physician. Is that right? Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah, he was a PCOM grad. They did a general surgery intern year back then. That was the plan. Instead of what I did, which was a neurosurgical intern year. He did general surgery, and I think it was Columbus, Ohio. And then he was the first graduate through the PCOM neurosurgical residency when it was run by Dr. Richard Kanoff. So it was just the two of them, at least for a few years, whereas Dr. Kanoff is the program director, and my dad was, the only resident.
It's amazing. Yeah. Now, did you know, so growing up, did you know that he was an osteopath? Did you have any idea what that meant? Did that mean anything, or?
I mean, it did to me only because I knew, and I was always curious. I think the first thing that you notice is my father was a physician, but he had DO at the end of his name instead of MD. So I'm like, I'd see it on his business card and I would say what does this mean? And we kind of started going through the philosophy and, a kind of patient first whole body attitude with him and getting a general understanding. And, I think interestingly enough, from his standpoint, was the smartest doctor I've ever met, not smartest neurosurgeon I've ever met. There would be things going on with patients that I would talk to him about that he would be making diagnoses and doing that were completely unrelated and out of bounds from a neurosurgical aspect that I was always just dumbfounded by because, I think during those times, he just learned so much more. And I always appreciated that to think to myself, what possibly the difference between these two fields.
Yeah, that's great. It's really nice. Yeah, I always think, how's my son going to think about what I do? Obviously, again, your dad did a good job and really impressed you early on. So where did you do your undergraduate training?
I did a year at Monmouth, went there specifically kind of to play golf. I was pre-med there for a year. I went down, I had a couple of shoulder surgeries. So I, ended that pipe dream and headed to College of Charleston in South Carolina, where I finished my undergrad and actually kind of took a little diversion. I switched my degree to business and spent some time working in a few different fields. I tried selling houses when the housing market had collapsed. And then I actually sold Mini Coopers for a year. And then I spent a year working in a Best Buy while I was taking my prerequisites to get back into school.
So you didn't go straight through. How many years of college did you do, or how long did it take you to do your undergraduate?
So my undergraduate was still 4 years. I loaded my senior year. So I finished and walked on time. And then I took 4 years off to work. And then during that fourth year was basically me. I had finished, I think, my prereqs during the third year, and the fourth year was my application year.
You did a full 4 years experiencing life. Now, during that 4 years, we always focus I want to be a doctor? Or were you thinking about doing business?
I was definitely thinking about doing business. I don't know if you or the listeners have watched the movie The Big Short. I was basically selling houses during that time of the collapse, and it was just absolutely awful. And then I got into selling Mini Coopers because a lot of my friends were over working at the BMW Mini Cooper dealership, and that was great because gas was $4 to $5 a gallon, and we were sold out of cars, and I was making all this money. But I just always in the back of my mind when I was miserable at work is I just had felt that medicine was always in the back of my mind. And, the more I talked to my family, the more that my mom and my stepmom and my grandmother were nurses, my father, obviously a DO physician. It seemed like the more I talked about it, it wasn't a matter of, am I going to pull the trigger on this? It was a matter of when. So I just, dove right in.
So now, Ryan, you decided you were going to apply. You took 4 years off, and then, you started your application process. Did you apply to MD schools and DO schools?
I actually only applied to one MD school, and that was Medical University of South Carolina, which was in Charleston, which is where I was living at the time. But otherwise, I just blanket applied to DO schools. I kind of grew up with that mentality. I was comfortable with it. It kind of seemed like a natural process. That's what I stuck with.
And where did you end up going to school?
I went to NICOM up in Westbury.
Was there a specific reason why you chose NICOM over the other schools?
I liked the location. I kind of liked the path of moving and learning new cities and being close to Manhattan. In a weird way, I kind of wanted to take a different path than my dad. I kind of wanted to forge my own way. And, obviously I kind of came back around to what his path was. But I think I was looking more to just, be myself and not be, Michael Moncman's son in some aspects.
So you got to NICOM. You started school. How did you like NICOM, and how was your experience there?
Yeah, I liked it a lot. Felt that the structure, I was just in the normal practice. I wasn't in case-based learning, but, I thought the facilities and the anatomy department and all the class and camaraderie amongst the students was very good, that, everybody was kind of helping each other out. And I really enjoyed the experience. I wouldn't go back and change it.
How did you decide that ultimately, obviously your dad is a neurosurgeon, and you said he had a great influence on you, but how did you ultimately, make the decision that that's what you wanted to do with your life also?
I got asked this question in one of my interviews where somebody said, who drove you into neurosurgery? And I said, Don Kreef. And Don Kreef was one of my dad's friends. He practices at Good Samaritan Hospital. And it just so happened that my first rotation, or a lot of my rotations as an MS3, were at Good Sam. And I got put on the neurosurgical service in my first few weeks, and he was the neurosurgeon that I was following. So I got in there and I got to help him take out a glioblastoma. He let me help take out some chunks of disc. He let me help do a part of a laminectomy and help close.
And again, just a translation. I told you already, I'm a plumber. So you were scooping a big tumor out of somebody's brain and like saving their life. And then like someone was going to be paralyzed or having pain shooting down their arm, and you're fixing the discs, and you're like, it's just you and him, right?
Correct.
Is that right?
Yeah. And I'm definitely sensationalizing what I was doing as an MS3 at the time. He did all the blood.
I like it.
Yeah, and he handed me a little pair of tweezers, the smallest ones they could find, and I lifted a small piece of the tumor out. And the same thing, he pulls all the important things away, and he puts those tweezers back in, and I pull out a chunk of disc. But exactly, yeah, glioblastoma is a very aggressive tumor, and we were, helping a patient who was symptomatic and to extend their life. And then the same thing for the laminectomy and the discectomy is to just try to help with pain and those types of things.
So you feel like, again, your dad set the foundation, and then your experience with this other neurosurgeon who happened to be good friends with your dad. Again, not surprising. Your dad's a great guy. This guy was a great guy. And he really just, inspired you would say, and that's how you made the decision?
Yeah, I think it was just watching his presence in the operating room and the way that he treated people just kind of resonated with me. My dad was very similar, but being able to see that this was just another person that did things very similarly. He's also a DO. It just really struck me that this is the way that life could be. And I had always known that I wanted to take the surgical path. I always tell medical students, the first decision that you have to make, you don't have to say, I'm going to be a gastroenterologist or I'm going to be a neurosurgeon. You really just need to say, like, do I want to do medicine or do I want to do surgery? I always knew surgery was going to be the path that I really wanted to go down. And then, I had the opportunity to do general surgery, neurosurgery, ENT, all those things. And this is the one I liked the most. And, he just was another building block or another piece to that puzzle that really told me that this is where I wanted to head.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Ryan. I have to just echo your sentiment. I think that's great advice. And, again, for me, I love medicine, so I respect surgeons. I do procedures. I definitely like the procedural part, but like in my heart, I'm an internist. And it's definitely a different mindset than a surgeon. And obviously we need both. But I think that's great advice. Just kind of see what fits your personality and what makes you happy, right?
I think in so many aspects of life, we say, like, make sure you get this big global picture. But I think within the medical world, you never want to get advice from a neurosurgeon on what he thinks a gastroenterologist's life is like. Because I could have a lot of bad things to say, which is all just secondhand information, and I know nothing. When we have people rotating through our service, we have MS1s and MS2s that come on, they tell us what they're interested in. And I'd never say anything bad about another service because I don't know anything. My life is so involved in neurosurgery now that if I were to tell you what it's like being an ED physician, I would just tell you, I know that they work shifts. That's it.
Right.
I have no idea what their workflow is like other than that they're there during certain hours and they're not there during other hours. So it's important that the students go and they experience that.
So now, I always ask people, how they pick their residency. And specifically, a lot of people that we've had, a lot of docs that we've had on the podcast have done allopathic residencies, but you did an osteopathic neurosurgical residency. It sounds like that was just natural for you because, you went to osteopathic school. Your dad did a neurosurgery osteopathic fellowship. Again, I'm going to go back to my own experiences, not a lot of GI osteopathic programs, but are there a good number of neurosurgical programs that are DO? And was there a question about allopathic? Was it an easy decision? And how'd you pick your residency?
5 years ago, I guess now, there were many more osteopathic neurosurgical programs than there are currently. We're going through, I mean, you obviously know, but we're going through this merger, this DOMD merger that has not only limited the number of programs that are available, but has also split the match, where students have to make this decision for doing the allopathic versus the osteopathic match. And certain programs belong to each, and you have to make a decision, which is a whole nother story. But it was never a question about applying allopathic. I think the 3 or 4 years prior to me applying for the osteopathic match, they had taken 0 osteopathic residents in the allopathic match. So it didn't take step 1. I only took the osteopathic board exams or the osteopathic training exams going forward. And it was a pretty straight and narrow path. It was a lot easier, I think, than what they have to do today. When it came to picking PCOM versus other programs, I looked at kind of everything. I liked the aspect that it was another new city. Like, I was born in Philadelphia, but I left here when I was 3. It's close to my family. I love working for Dr. Yoakum. He's an incredible person and physician, and coming here and working under him was a no-brainer. I enjoyed the camaraderie amongst the residents, the locations and the hospitals that we work at. Cooper is one of the busiest trauma centers in the country, and Abington and Einstein, we get a great mix of cases with attendings who trained at, Penn and Temple, UPMC. We just have this great mix of faculty. Not that the other places didn't, but when I was kind of weighing, when you're trying to juggle all of everything at the same time, it just kind of made the most sense to me. And then at the end, I think that the fact that my dad was here was kind of like a full circle thing for me. I thought it was going to be kind of neat to kind of come back and go through what he went through.
That's great. And now so far, so you're 5th year neurosurgical resident, which I could have introduced you that way, but I figured we get to that part.
Yeah.
So how are you loving it? And is it a crazy amount of, neurosurgery to me seems like crazy. It's like there's so much to learn and so much to do. And obviously you have people's lives in your hands at every minute that you're operating. What is a time commitment like? Is it like taking your whole life? Do you have time for a life? And again, do you love it?
Yeah, so I love it. I kind of learned from doing that real estate job where I sat there and I did nothing for weeks and months on end because there was just no work, that if I was going to have to punch a time card and there was no work to be done, I would not enjoy my life. So the great thing I love about neurosurgery is when we're busy, we're busy. And if I work hours and hours and hours, then I'm doing work. So it doesn't bother me in the least. I think that the work-life balance is not as bad as people make it out to be. I met my wife, who's an orthopedic surgery resident, 3 years ago, I guess now. I met her when I was a PGY 2 and she's a PGY 1, and we're about to start my PGY 6 year, and her PGY 5 is her chief year. She's going to be a fellow at Jeff next year. We've had no issues with planning a life and going on trips, and we see each other every night. Those are the fun things that we get to hear. I think that, if you spoke to Matthew Rosenzweig, who I think is going to be on the podcast, the same thing. He's married to his wife as a professional as well. And we joke all the time that people talk about how busy our lives are, and they are, but we just make times for our wives and, for him, his son.
Appreciate that. Definitely, my wife is, I don't have that piece. Like, my wife was a dietitian and she's home with the kids, and, which makes my life a little easier. Do you find that, both having a crazy, busy, hectic resident schedule, and again, this is for other people in training that are, married to physicians or thinking about marrying another physician, do you find that a huge challenge, or is it something that just kind of works itself out?
I think it works itself out. I mean, regardless, I guess, of profession, like you're talking about, if your wife was a dietitian previously as a stay-at-home mom and wife, it's no easier for her or harder for her. Like, she is still making countless sacrifices and working her butt off every day. So it's always a give and take. It's always trying to figure out, when my wife is super busy, I'm grocery shopping and cooking, right, and meal planning and doing all those things. And, she normally takes her boards early in the year. I take my boards late in the year. During those months leading up to board studying, just as, all the medical students are getting ready for step 1 and step 2 and step 3, like, that person has to be a support system in your life, just like your family, your friends, all those types of things. And my life has certainly been made easier by my wife. There's no doubt about that, and I think that anybody who thinks And I don't necessarily want to say that this is a wrong way to think. Everybody has to kind of come up with their own system to get through this because it's a grueling process. Medical school and residency and fellowship and even becoming an attending is going to be a grueling process. But if you make it a point to make these things important to you and your life, you'll find time for them. I think that's the most important thing. And that's what's always been key for me. And now like my wife and my future family is just to be able to say, like, we are going to take this time together. If it means I have to really key into how I'm going to study for an hour and a half so that I have 30 minutes to spend with my wife or an hour to have dinner with my wife, I will probably key into that studying more than I would if I knew I had 2.5 or 3 hours to kind of go through things.
Yeah, I think time management is huge, right? No doubt, no doubt for all of us. And if you want to make it work, you make it work. I totally agree with that. So my next question for you is, you already gave me great advice. I think you gave the residents, and the medical students going through great advice in trying to figure out, medicine or surgery, what fits their personality. Can you think of any piece of advice that was given to you, maybe by your dad or your neurosurgical mentor at Good Sam or now in Philly? Can you think of like one piece of advice that was given to you that you think changed your life maybe and that you'd like to pass on to our listeners?
Yeah. Whenever I was young, I always I would notice when I was walking into the hospital with my dad, the security guards and the janitors and the people who are serving our foods and all of those people that are really helping keep the hospital run and buzz. He'd say, hello, call them by their first name. They'd say, hey, Mike, or hey, Dr. Moncman, and really just cultivating a relationship with everybody you work with, regardless of, whatever you would consider a basement level job is to whatever you would consider, the ceiling, the CEO. You want to treat everyone with respect. And like we discussed before, this is a grueling process, but neurosurgery, for instance, is a 7-year residency on its own without any types of fellowship. I want to work with people I like. There are a lot of smart, capable people out there. So the advice I was given is just treat everybody with respect. Always lend a helping hand and do those things, and you'll notice it. And, from a standpoint of being a senior level resident at this point, or even when I was a junior level resident, we all know we can be nice to each other for short periods of time. Right. So if you're trying to get a job and you're being mean to one person and you're being nice to the people who you think are the decision makers, it doesn't go unnoticed.
I think that's amazing advice. And we did have a little conversation, prior to the interview. And in that same light, you were telling me how you use that same theory to assess students. Can you just kind of tell our listeners a little bit about that? I think that was great also.
Yeah, I think my wording was a little bit different. I just said that they're going to always be super nice to us. If I catch a medical student being mean to one of the staff, somebody who's helping mop the floors in the OR, if they're not helping turn over rooms and doing all these things that we think are, tasks that aren't responsible for us as physicians, that's who I think you truly are as a person. I don't think that the people being nice to me during a 30-day basis is always going to be the true person that I see. The true person that you see is going to be whenever you don't have anything to gain by being nice to somebody, right? If you're nice to the person that you have nothing to gain from, that's who you are. If you have something to gain from me or anyone else, the program directors, you're going to go out of your way to try to be nice. But I'm more interested in the latter or in the previous. I want to know that that's who you are, that's what I'm going to get for the next 7 years.
Yeah, I think that's perfect advice. What I usually tell people is just, it's how your mom raised you and, being a good person and all of those things make you a great doctor, more than the smarts and the intelligence and the hard work, or maybe just amplify things. I think that's amazing advice for medical students and residents, that if they're going to showcase, it's not all about showing what they know. It's just showing that they're good people and that's going to make them a great doctor. And good doctors like you are going to see that and recognize that, and that's going to help get them ahead.
I watch our chief, not chief resident, I watch our chief of neurosurgery after every case mop his floors for room turnover. So there isn't a single job in any hospital that should be below any of us, because at the end of the day, we're all on one team. We're all there for the patients to try to help, and we're all trying to, the same thing, time management. If mopping the floor and picking up the trash is going to get me home to my wife and my family, I'm all for it. I'm here for it.
Perfect. So you're in your fifth year. How many years is a neurosurgical residency?
It's 7 years. We're about to switch over here on July 1, so I have a little over 2 years left.
Do you have some ideas about where you want to practice or what you want to do?
Right now, I would like to just do general neurosurgery. I don't have a budding interest in any one specific road. I kind of like the mix of trauma and spine and, some tumor work and those types of things. In terms of where we want to go, it's kind of a moving target with, I think our first and foremost is we're going to look at best loan repayment options, but I think mostly we want to move somewhere warm. So maybe Southeast or Southwest, something like that.
And so, I usually ask that question too. I hope it's not too personal, but, I think a lot of the listeners are students and residents that are looking at big loans. It sounds like you did take loans. Is that correct for school?
Oh, yeah, it's not a personal question. I scream from the rooftops from everybody who likes to talk about it. I mean, my wife and I owe over $1 million in student loan debt. So it's a real issue, I think. It's something I know that we're constantly working on trying to figure out how we're going to bring down student loan debt and those types of things. But it really, really weighs on your decision. I think from our standpoint, what we're looking at is just trying to get that down and not have it be a burden for the next 30 years for loan repayments, just because, you watch, I think my loan started at, I think I took out like 80 to 90 a year. So let's just say 360, for instance, and it's already up over 500 in interest in my 5 years of residency.
Right.
It's just insanity. But
right. So does this stress you out? Like, do you wake up in the morning sometimes and say like, shoot, we owe $1 million? Or is it just like, it's just part of the deal and you let it roll off your back? And
it's part of the deal, like from a listener standpoint, trying to think about what people may think about whenever I say, neurosurgery from the scope of practices and orthopedic surgery from the scope of practices pays well, but still it is a big number. But I never look at this being like, well, this is a 7-year sprint. I just want to get out of it. I always just say to myself, like, that $1 million is going to get paid off one way or the other. These 7 years are going to go by. So one way or another, you just are going to have to figure it out. I mean, I think, weighs on us from time to time in terms of trying to decide starting a family and buying a house and doing all those types of things. But, I think one way or another, you're going to get whatever that student loan payment is and you're going to pay it and you'll make financial decisions based upon that. And I never kind of went into this for the money. If you wiped all my student loan payment away and you cut whatever my salary was going to be by a 10th, I may not want to work 150 hours a week as an attending, but
right.
I would still love, doing all those procedures I talked about earlier in this podcast. I love doing, like, these procedures are a lot of fun. I feel bad, obviously, for the patients and families and those types of things, but that's what we're all here for. That's why we're trained, to try to help people. And so that was a very long answer to just say,
yeah, no, that's perfect.
Yeah. Honestly, I never worry about the money because I just figure one way or the other, we're going to figure it out.
Yeah. I think, that's perfect. That's the right answer. Obviously 15 years in, I had loans also. And, I think everybody worries about these things to some extent. It sounds like you less than most. I definitely worried about it going through, and I didn't have things. I don't know if you've ever seen like White Coat Investor, or, there are all these docs that have podcasts now and talk about things like living like a resident for a few years after you finish, which I think is, what you were alluding to about waiting on the house. And I think, that's just smart. You just aggressively pay it down, and it doesn't affect most doctors' lives. I think that's right.
Yeah. I mean, there are everybody's the kind of the time management and the things that we talked about before. You're going to have to make a decision on where you want to live and stay close to family, but there are certain areas in the country that everybody can move to, and there's, locums and call and all kinds of stuff you can do, and you can expedite the process of paying off those things. But again, is it worth your time? Is it worth, missing certain things with your kids or with your spouse, or, less vacation whenever from a mental health standpoint, what's going to be best for you? And I think that it's hard. I don't not stress about the money. I don't know what to stress about yet.
Yeah, nothing to stress about. The end of the story is you'll pay it off. Everything will be fine. And ends up not being a big deal. It's just hard in perspective, and it sounds like you're doing a great job. Ryan, first, thank you again for being with us. I think this has been great. My last question for you is, okay, so we have a young medical student or someone doing a surgical internship, and they listen to you and they're like, I agree with Storch. this guy's a brain surgeon. He's cool. I want to be like him. That sounds amazing. What advice would you give, say, a medical student that's thinking about something like neurosurgery, which is so specialized and difficult to get? Can you give some advice to somebody outside? Obviously you've given a ton of great advice already, but is there any specific advice on someone that wants to do neurosurgery as a career?
Yeah, I mean, the big push that's even been in the last 5 years, not that it hasn't been previous, but even specifically, I think within the osteopathic students that are coming through have a much larger resume of research that we're seeing. So I would say get involved early and often in research, and it's such a basic comment to make because there's no direction to that, but it's reach out to the research departments in your school, find out who's doing what. And then, it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take time to figure out what you want to get into. Find out who you can rotate with and spend time on those services. And really don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. I think the thing that, looking back the most, that I wish I did more as a medical student was doing not necessarily complex procedures, but just scrubbing in and retracting and doing these little things and helping out residents. You learn so much without having any repercussions for your actions, as opposed to being a PGY1 or a first year resident, where now you're actually responsible for these things. And when you don't do them exactly right or correct, you have something to answer for. So it's nice to kind of like break the ice and learn all these things as a young medical student. I think the more involved that you are in these teams, more and more that get to know these people for people, not just for residents. Because I think it sounds, or at least from my opinion, it sounds incredibly cool to drill holes in people's heads and take out brain tumors and do this
cool to me,
emergency surgery. But, I make it sound okay, at least in my mind, I make it sound okay because I'm fine with the lifestyle. I've lived it. I've watched my father do it. But find out what these people do with their free time. See how well they handle that work-life balance and what their stress level seems like, and see if that's something that's going to be for you, because, that's the other part of life. Like my life, like some people are defined by their careers. I don't want to be defined by being a neurosurgeon. I just want to be defined by being me. That's it. I want to do the things I want to do. I want to spend time with the people who I spend time with, and I want to help as many patients as possible. So, me outside of the hospital, if people think that work-life balance is something that they would want, then that's what you should aspire to get.
That's awesome, Ryan. Again, I really appreciate your time. I'm sure our listeners appreciate your time. And I know you're going on vacation and packing and trying to study and do your fellowship. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Dr. Sorge.
This concludes our episode of Do or Do Not. Send all inquiries, comments, suggestions, and even let us know if there's someone you want us to interview to doordonotpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to like us on Facebook at Do or Do Not Podcast for updates. If you enjoyed our podcast, please share it with your classmates and administration. We have plenty of more interviews lined up, and we're excited to share them with you. This is Tianyu Shea, OMS 3. Thank you guys so much for listening to Do or Do Not.